What are sensation and perception? Sensation and perception are states of progressing of the senses in human and animal systems, such as vision, auditory, vestibular, and pain senses. Some authors define sensation as the reactions that occur when information interacts with the sensory receptors. It is, for example, when the ray lights contact the eyes and become focused on the retina, where the light is converted into electrical impulse that will be transmitted to the brain through the optical nerve. In the brain, the interpretation of what was sensed by the eyes, the recognition of color, for example, shape and patterns, is what we call perception. But how do these sensations and perceptions develop? Can a newborn see? If so, what can it perceive? How do sensation and perception change when adults become older? In order to answer these questions, let's first learn about some neurophysiological structures and processes. We'll start defining receptors. We have so many receptors in our body. They are specialized cells or subcellular structures that transduce an environmental stimulus into electrical impulse that can be interpreted by the nervous system. Sensors can be classified by the nature of the stimulus. For example, mechanoreceptors are related to distortion of the surrounding tissues. Chemoreceptors are related to substance in the interstitial fluids. And photoreceptors are sensitive to light, for example, while thermoreceptors are sensitive to warming or cooling. They can also be classified by the origin of the stimulus. For example, stereoreceptors come from outside, interoreceptors come from inside, and proprioceptors from the body itself. Although there are several sensors in our body system, here we specifically explore the development of visual, auditory, and kinesthetic sensation and perception. Let's start with visual development. Important changes in visual perception as we develop can be tracked to the difference in how the eye itself functions over time. For example, how clearly we can see an object. However, there is much more to learn than just change in the eye. Visual acuity, for example, is one of the characteristics of the eye function that explain how clear one can see. At birth, the nerves, muscles, and lens of the eye are still developing. As a result, newborns cannot see small things that are far away. In fact, the newborn vision is only 5% of the adult acuity, or 20 by 400 on the Snellen scale of visual acuity. This means that a newborn can see at 20 feet what a typical adult can see at 240 feet away. Visual sensation continues to develop during childhood. By 6 months of age, on average, vision is 20 by 40. 5 years old, for example, have visual acuity of about 20 by 30, and by the age 10, children without visual anomaly reach the desirable level of 20 by 20. However, as we age, changes in the visual system occur, and some conditions and diseases become prevalent, especially in older adults. A typical example of the declining process is a condition called presbyopia. Presbyopia is the gradual loss of power to focus on a near object due to the aging process. Other conditions that are also more prevalent in older adults are cataract, glaucoma, and age-related maculopathy. Although visual acuity is important to perform motor skills, the way we perceive the space three-dimensionally allows for precision in our movements in a certain environment. To perceive three dimensions, individual must perceive depth and distance. One source of depth perception is the retinal disparity. This is the difference in the images received by two eyes as a result of the different locations. Another source of depth perception is called motion parallax. Motion parallax is a depth cue that results from our motion. As we move, for example, objects that are closer to us move faster across our visual field than the objects that are far away in distance. In a classical experiment, Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk constructed a mini cliff with a drop-off cover by a plexiglass in their laboratory. They placed the infants on the edge of the visual cliff, and they had their mothers coax them to crawl onto the glass side. Most infants would not crawl out on the glass, choosing instead to remain on the shallow side, an indication that they could perceive depth. The 6 12-month-old infants in the visual cliff experiment had extensive visual experience. The question is, do younger infants without this experience still perceive that? Since younger infants do not crawl, this question is very difficult to answer. However, 2 to 4 months old infants show difference in heart rate when they are placed directly on the deep side of the visual cleft. Well, although these findings are not conclusive, we do know that infants develop the ability to use binocular cues to depth by about 3 to 4 months of age. Later in life, older than young adults fail depth perception tests. Higher failure rates are directly related to increase in age and occurrence of visual deficits. Another important aspect of visual perception is the ability to detect objects in their relative position in the space. Perception of the object, boundaries, for example, and edges help us embed objects and figures in a certain background. This ability is called figured ground perception. On the other hand, we should also be able to discriminate parts of a picture on an object from the whole, and yet integrate the parts into the entire image, perceiving them simultaneously. We know very little of infants' ability to perceive edges and boundaries, but we know that children around 4 years of age show improvements in figured ground perception tasks. Very young infants have difficulty integrating objects that form a whole. In general, children under 9 years of age typically report seeing only the entire image or only the parts at different times. After 9, most children can integrate parts and the whole into the total image. Note that adults' level of sensitivity to object perception cues far exceed what is necessary, so infants may still perceive objects fairly well, even though not at adults' levels. Object perception also consists of size and shape constancy. Size constancy is the perception of actual object size despite of size of its image as projected in our retina. Think of when you see an airplane landing at the airport. The size of the aircraft is constant despite of the change that happen in our visual field. A child may think that the aircraft is increasing in size as it gets closer and closer. Slater and his colleagues in 1990 showed that newborns have already developed size constancy. Shape constancy, on the other hand, is the perception of the actual object shape despite its orientation to a viewer. It has been shown if an infant becomes familiar with one shape, the newborn will spend more time looking at the novel shape. Another important characteristic of object perception is object orientation. It is also crucial to recognize that two objects are identical even if one is tipped or even upside down. A simple example is the ability to differentiate the letters B and D. Children at 3 to 4 years of age can learn bidirectional extremes such as high and low, over and under, and front and back. By age 8, most children have learned to differentiate angles and diagonals, but may still confuse on left and right. Finally, it is particular interest of motor development the perception of motion. It is known that specific neurophysiological mechanisms are dedicated to perceive motion. Cortical cells fire according to the direction, location, and speed of an object on the retina. The medial temporal area of the visual cortex is dedicated to processing motor signals. Direction of motion is not well perceived until 8 weeks of age. As the child develops, perception of motion improves to adult levels. Perception of thresholds will most likely show decrements in older adulthood. However, it is likely that attention and experience plays a role into this process. The final questions here are: how we can keep up with our senses working optimally? What should we do to minimize decrements of our visual perception ability and therefore maintain our great motor control? These are great questions, and many of those questions are those that researchers in motor development are trying to answer. We can also determine the location of an event by sound, and even to tell if someone is approaching or leaving us by listening to the sounds produced. Although we think that vision is more necessary to skill performance, auditory perception gives us much information about the environment in which we move. Auditory perception involves location, difference between similar sounds. It involves patterns of sounds, and also auditory figure and ground. Location is related to direction and distance from whom a sound is produced. Newborns turn in direction of the sound and they rapidly improve their ability to locate sound during the first year of life. It seems that from birth, individuals have already some sense of the location of the sounds that are in the environment and rapidly improve in determining both the direction and the distance of sounds. Older adults with presbyopia, for example, show decrements in the ability to locate sound. In fact, it has been shown that older adults that demonstrate good speech discrimination abilities also showed typical sound localization. Another auditory ability is the perception of different sounds, like those with similar pitch, loudness, or speed sounds such as D, T, P, and B. Research has found that infants as young as 1 to 4 months are able to discriminate basic speech sounds like P, B, and M. The sound deficit in hearing speech sounds among older adults seem to be minimal. Individuals also perceive relationships between sounds. This is patterns such as time, intensity, and frequency. Infants young as 2 to 3 months perceive change in temporal patterns, but only at the end of the first year, infants can perceive sound on the basis of temporal pattern, which is probably a prerequisite for language development. Finally, a person should be able to detect sound among ambient noise. This is the auditory figure and ground differentiation. It is like talking on the phone while music is playing all the time, and young adults can differentiate sounds from a noisy background, and the ability to make fine discriminations improve in childhood. As we finish this episode, it's important to highlight that perception of auditory events in the environment during adulthood is likely disturbed only when age-related changes happen. In fact, when injury and disease affect detection of sounds.